Christmas Day 2025. While most Americans were celebrating with family, Donald Trump chose that exact moment to publicly humiliate America's closest ally. He didn't just criticize Canada. He didn't just threaten tariffs. He suggested, again, that Canada should surrender its sovereignty and become the 51st state of the United States. He treated an independent nation like a subordinate territory that existed purely for Washington's convenience. The Republican establishment's response? Absolute silence. Senators whose own states depended on Canadian markets said nothing. Party leaders who claimed to champion American workers looked the other way. Nobody warned Trump that insulting your largest trading partner during the holidays might carry consequences. And then something happened that nobody in Washington anticipated. Canadians didn't wait for their government to impose formal sanctions. They didn't need parliamentary votes or sweeping legislation. They did something far simpler and far more devastating. They stopped buying American products, quietly at first, then visibly, and finally at a scale that could no longer be ignored. What emerged was the largest consumer-driven boycott Canada has seen in modern memory. And it wasn't random. It was focused, strategic, and brutally effective. The boycott zeroed in on industries that had historically supported Trump and Republican campaigns. Industries that had poured millions into political donations. Industries that believed their political loyalty would protect them from consequences. Among those industries, one stood out above all others: American bourbon. Bourbon isn't just another export category. It's woven into American identity, especially in states like Kentucky. For decades, Canadian bars and restaurants stocked American bourbon as the default choice. Bartenders reached for it automatically. Consumers ordered it out of habit. It was embedded in the culture. And that's exactly why losing that market has been so catastrophic. The numbers tell a brutal story. American bourbon exports to Canada have collapsed by approximately 85%. That's not a slowdown. That's not a temporary dip. That's the near total destruction of a market that took generations to build, and the consequences are now impossible to hide. One of the most iconic names in American spirits just announced it will shut down its main distillery for an entire year. A facility that has operated continuously since the 1930s is going dark. 1,500 unionized workers, people who did absolutely nothing to provoke this crisis, are now staring at an uncertain future. Families who built their lives around stable manufacturing jobs are facing layoffs because Donald Trump couldn't resist insulting Canada on Christmas. The explanations coming from industry executives are telling, not because they're convincing, but because they reveal just how desperate the situation has become. We're hearing about facility upgrades. We're hearing about inventory management. We're hearing vague references to changing consumer preferences among younger generations. None of that withstands even basic scrutiny. Production is already down dramatically. Sales to Canada, historically one of bourbon's most reliable export markets, have fallen off a cliff. And yet the industry wants us to believe this is all just coincidence. That a market collapse of this magnitude has nothing to do with the political crisis everyone can see happening in real time. Local journalists in Kentucky aren't buying it, and they're telling readers exactly where to look if they want answers. Look north. What makes this damage particularly dangerous for American bourbon producers is how consumer markets actually work. Once a habit is broken, it doesn't automatically reset just because political conditions change. When Canadian bars removed American bourbon from their shelves, they didn't stop serving whiskey, they found alternatives. Canadian whiskey brands, Irish whiskey, Scotch, Japanese labels, premium craft spirits from smaller producers around the world, and in the process, both bartenders and customers discovered something critically important. They didn't miss American bourbon as much as they thought they would. That's the nightmare scenario for any established brand. Not anger, which can fade, not boycotts, which can eventually end, but indifference. The realization that your product is replaceable, that consumers can move on without you and feel perfectly satisfied with what they find instead. Brand loyalty takes years, sometimes decades, to build, and it can be destroyed in moments. Once consumers form new purchasing habits, once they discover alternatives they actually prefer, they rarely return to the old brand just because a political crisis resolves. Even if trade negotiations resume tomorrow, even if Trump and Canadian officials sign new agreements, the damage at the consumer level is already done. This isn't theoretical. We're already seeing the evidence across multiple companies. Another major American whiskey brand announced layoffs months ago, citing a massive drop in Canadian sales. And those numbers were recorded before the boycott reached its current intensity, before the social pressure to avoid American products became widespread across Canadian society. Smaller distilleries have been hit even harder. One prominent Kentucky bourbon producer has already filed for bankruptcy, and what happened next should alarm anyone who understands how the industry operates. When the company attempted to use its aging barrels of whiskey as collateral to secure emergency financing, the bankruptcy court rejected the proposal outright. Expert testimony made it devastatingly clear. The secondary market for bourbon barrels, assets that were once considered reliable long-term stores of value, had completely collapsed. The judge's assessment was stark and unforgiving. Selling that inventory would require enormous discounts, if buyers could even be found at all. Think about what that means. An entire asset class, something the industry had relied on for generations as a financial safety net, hollowed out almost overnight. A decade ago, American whiskey was experiencing a golden age. Exports were booming. New craft distilleries were opening across Kentucky and Tennessee. Investors were eager to get involved. Industry analysts spoke confidently about unlimited growth potential. American bourbon had become a genuine global cultural export, a symbol of American craftsmanship, tradition, and quality. Foreign consumers didn't just buy it as a commodity, they bought into the story, the heritage, the image of authenticity. That narrative took generations to build, and now it's been shattered. Not by changing consumer tastes, not by superior competition from international producers, but by a self-inflicted political wound delivered by a president who fundamentally misunderstood where economic power actually resides in the modern world. Here's where the political dimension becomes impossible to ignore. Many of these companies now suffering catastrophic losses were generous financial supporters of Republican campaigns. They made calculated political investments, they donated to candidates who promised deregulation, tax cuts, and business-friendly policies. They believed that alignment with political power would protect their commercial interests. Instead, that political alignment placed them directly in the crosshairs. There's a certain grim irony in watching the economic consequences land precisely on the industries and workers who provided the political support that enabled Trump's rise in the first place. Kentucky, the heart of American bourbon country, voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. And now Kentucky workers are losing their jobs because of decisions Trump made without considering the consequences. What's even more striking than the economic devastation itself is the response, or rather the complete lack of response, from the American political establishment. Senators representing states where bourbon production is a cornerstone of the economy have remained silent. Congressional leaders who built entire careers claiming to defend American workers refuse to challenge the man whose actions directly triggered this collapse. Union jobs are disappearing by the hundreds. Manufacturing facilities that have anchored communities for nearly a century are shutting down. And the elected officials who are supposed to represent those workers and those communities are absolutely nowhere to be found. This silence isn't accidental, it's strategic cowardice. These politicians understand perfectly well what's happening, they know the damage is real, but they've made a calculation that challenging Trump carries greater political risk than allowing their own constituents to suffer economic ruin. Now contrast that deafening silence with what's actually happening in Canada. The country that was supposed to collapse under American economic pressure, the nation Trump expected to come crawling back begging for relief, is instead thriving. Canada's economy has shown remarkable resilience throughout this entire crisis. Recent employment data shows job growth accelerating, not contracting. Unemployment has fallen to its lowest level in over a year. Economic analysts are comparing current Canadian performance to historic periods of expansion. The country that Trump tried to intimidate into submission adapted instead, and they did it without resorting to formal government sanctions or sweeping trade restrictions. They simply stopped rewarding disrespect with loyalty. This outcome wasn't inevitable. It was the direct result of choices. Choices made by millions of individual Canadian consumers who decided they would not continue supporting businesses from a country whose leader treated them with contempt. Choices made by Canadian bartenders and restaurant owners who quietly removed American products from their shelves and replaced them with alternatives. Choices that accumulated day after day until the economic impact became impossible to ignore. Here's what Donald Trump fundamentally misunderstood about modern economic power. You can threaten tariffs through official government channels. You can issue ultimatums in press conferences. You can negotiate trade agreements behind closed doors, but you cannot force individual consumers to buy your products. You cannot bully millions of people into brand loyalty, and you absolutely cannot intimidate your way into trust. Once that consumer trust evaporates, no trade negotiation can simply restore it. No diplomatic agreement can force a bartender in Toronto to stock American bourbon again. No tariff threat can compel a customer in Vancouver to choose your product over the alternative they've already discovered and prefer. Trump started this confrontation genuinely believing that Canada had no options. He believed that economic size alone guaranteed American victory. He assumed that pressure would inevitably produce capitulation. He was catastrophically wrong, and now the consequences of that miscalculation are landing squarely on American workers who had absolutely no say in creating this crisis. What we're witnessing now is something Donald Trump has never been able to process, let alone control. This is not a negotiation that can be resolved in a boardroom. This is not a tariff schedule that can be adjusted through executive orders. This is millions of individual Canadians making daily purchasing decisions quietly and deliberately to withdraw their economic support from American products. And there is absolutely nothing in Trump's political toolkit that can force them to reverse course. That's the part that genuinely terrifies people who actually understand how markets operate. According to sources familiar with ongoing trade discussions, Trump has reportedly demanded that Canadian government officials somehow ensure American alcohol returns to store shelves across Canada. Think about the sheer arrogance embedded in that demand. He insults an entire nation. He questions their sovereignty. He treats their citizens like obstacles instead of partners. And then he expects consumer loyalty to simply resume as if respect were completely irrelevant to commerce. That's not how markets work. That's not how human beings work. You can pressure governments through diplomatic channels. You can attempt to bully regulators into compliance, but you cannot order a bartender in Toronto to pour American bourbon. You cannot force a restaurant owner in Montreal to restock products their customers have consciously decided to reject. And once consumers internalize that sense of agency, once they realize their individual choices actually matter and carry real economic consequences, that power doesn't simply evaporate when political conditions shift. This is where Trump's entire worldview collapses. He built his approach to leadership on the assumption that power flows downward, that intimidation produces obedience, that threats generate compliance. But consumer boycotts operate horizontally. They don't require coordination from the top. They don't depend on politicians maintaining party discipline. They exist entirely outside formal structures of governmental authority. And that makes them incredibly resilient to traditional forms of political pressure. Even if a comprehensive new trade agreement were signed tomorrow, even if Trump stood at a podium and declared complete victory, nothing would fundamentally change on the ground. Canadian consumers would still walk past American bourbon in liquor stores. Bars would continue stocking the alternative brands they've already adopted. Purchasing habits would remain broken. Brand associations would stay damaged. Trust would continue eroding. That's what makes this moment so economically dangerous for American industries caught in this political crossfire. The damage isn't temporary, it's structural, and it's spreading beyond bourbon into a broader recalibration of consumer behavior that will echo through markets for years. The human cost of this collapse cannot be overstated. Behind every shuttered distillery and every bankruptcy filing are workers whose lives are being upended through no fault of their own. Families who relied on stable union jobs now face crushing uncertainty. Communities built around legacy industries for generations are left scrambling to survive, and none of these people asked for this economic war. Donald Trump will never personally experience these consequences. He will never worry about missing a mortgage payment because his factory closed. He will never lose health insurance coverage because bourbon exports collapsed. He will never stand outside a shuttered distillery wondering how to explain the situation to his children. That burden falls entirely on ordinary American workers, and the political leaders who could have intervened, who could have warned Trump about the inevitable consequences of treating allies like enemies, chose silence instead. This is what leadership without accountability looks like. Trump has spent a lifetime avoiding consequences. He stiffed contractors, he bankrupted businesses, he walked away while others absorbed his losses, but this situation is fundamentally different. There is no bankruptcy court to manipulate. There is no legal settlement to negotiate his way out of. There is no political maneuver that can restore consumer trust once it's been destroyed. This is a verdict delivered daily by millions of individual consumers making quiet choices. And that verdict is final. Trump believed intimidation was strength. He believed allies had no alternatives. He believed markets would obey threats. Instead, he's watching American industries collapse under the weight of his own arrogance. That is the real shockwave moving through his political base